Welcome to Eyes on the Blaze. We're right on the hour, so let's get started. This is our first webinar of the series, Cultivating Caution 2026. Today we are going to talk about fire surveillance and safety tips for agricultural structural fires. My name is Salah Issa, and with me is Bill Fulton.
Good morning. I'm Bill Fulton. I'm the Assistant Fire Chief down at Salem Fire Protection District in Southern Illinois. And I'm also a senior field instructor with the Illinois Fire Service Institute. I've been in the fire service for a little over 30 years and 22 years with the Fire Service Institute. But just as importantly, I was raised on a farm, live on a farm, have managed a farm, so I have a pretty good handle on things that happen on farms.
Thank you, Bill. And I am Salah Issa. I have a PhD in agricultural safety from the University of Purdue University. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and extension specialist. Part of my work is to try to understand what is occurring in Illinois when it comes to agricultural safety. Where are the incidents occurring? Where are the injuries occurring? And what can we do to make a difference there? Today, we are going to describe the fire surveillance data for Illinois agriculture operations. We are going to look at fire prevention and safety tips for agricultural operations. And lastly, how do you prepare for fire, whether this is through an emergency action plan, using a fire extinguisher, or knowing your firefighters. To start with, it's important to tell you where my data is coming from. So one thing that we do in our Ag Safety and Health program, we are subscribed to a news clipping agency that reports out anytime there is an agricultural injury that's documented in a newspaper, a fire that's documented in a newspaper, or even a UTV incident that's documented in a newspaper. The key here, newspaper. So what this tends to be great at is actually really capturing unique cases. So grain entrapments tend to get reported in newspapers more frequently than other agriculture incidents, so we get a good sense on that. Similar with fire incidents. Any fire incident that causes severe damage or injury tends to get reported as well. So this is where the data is coming from. It's important to say it's not completely comprehensive. What I'm showing you in the data I show you below is the minimum amount of incidents, right? There's always going to be more that have not been reported for whatever reason in a newspaper. These incidents tend to focus more on the severe cases and the fatalities. That's generally, if it's a big incident, it becomes newsworthy and it reaches the news clippings. We do actually have around 30 years of data. I'll be showing you some of that in this series. So in 2025, we had no less than 51 fire incidents that occurred in agriculture operations in Illinois. And again, I reiterate, this is the numbers I'm showing you is the minimum amount of numbers that occurred. There's probably other incidents that did not reach newspapers or we failed to capture it for whatever reasons. Now, the important thing is, how do these incidents break down? And we see that about half of them are bonfires. And when these incidents occur, usually it impacts our animal production facilities. So we see a lot of chicken barns end up in fire. We had basically 8 goats, 6 horses, 5 pigs, and 1 dog also end up dying in these fires. Sometimes these barn fires impact where you're storing hay as well. And so we see a lot of hay getting burned in Illinois in 2025. In addition, there were 4 machine sheds and shops that were impacted and that burned down. That led to at least 1 tractor, 2 mowers, and other vehicles and equipment all burning down in Illinois. We had 10 field fires that impacted at minimum 420 acres that were burned down. Some of it is brush, but we also had corn and wheat. And we also had a Jeep that was in a field with tall grass that ended up burning the field down and the sheep with it. When it comes to grain facilities, we had 3 grain fires, 2 impacting a grain bin, and 1 was a conveyor belt fire. And lastly, we had 10 vehicle incidents. 9 of these were, so when I'm saying incidents, I mean basically fire incidents that occurred, and these incidents can burn multiple equipment. But in general, so a total of 9 combines, 2 tractors, and a grain cart, and 50 acres of farmland were burned down due to a vehicle fire incident. Given the number of cases we see in barn fires, we've decided that for today, we're going to focus on structural fires. And later on in September, we're going to focus our discussion on field and vehicle fires as well. So I'm going to share with you some cases that we've seen and some of the data, and then Bill will talk about from his experience how can you prevent these incidents. So one of the incidents that really was very impactful here in Illinois occurred in 2024, and this was a fire that impacted a farm with 5 barns, in which 4 of those barns burned down. And these barns housed 1.2 million chickens. They didn't count how many chickens died or survived, but they reported the vast majority died in this fire. You experienced that, Bill, right?
Yeah, we were actually a mutual aid department to this particular fire. We were about the 3rd department there. We took 2 engines and an aerial up there. The fire started after the employees had left for the day, and it had a really good start before anyone noticed the smoke and that kind of thing. And so it was really tough to get a hold of get on the downside of that fire curve. Hence the loss of the 4 barns and the chickens. From what I understand, it was in excess of a $70 million loss.
Yeah, this was huge. And each of those barns, by the way, were basically 200 yards long. So
right.
They were huge.
Huge. Yeah, it was, we were there for about 11 and a half hours. And I think actually in the picture you're seeing here, this is the processing plant that didn't burn. We actually got a stop right there where you see the flames. We got a stop on that, so it didn't take out their processing area. But it was a very tough fire to fight because of the scope of the buildings. The buildings were about 52 feet apart, so the radiant heat caused the other buildings to catch fire and so forth. Unfortunately, there was not an early warning system, which is not uncommon. And like I say, a passerby literally had to see the smoke and flames before anyone was called.
Yeah. And so we see basically chickens and pigs tend to be the most common animals impacted by fires here in Illinois. I
think a lot of that is because they're in confinement. We do have some of the beef cattle barns, some of the dairy barns that burn, but we don't see the actual animals being as much of an issue because they're not necessarily confined in those buildings like they are in the chickens and the hog industry. But there's a lot. These buildings are large also compared to some of the other facilities like in beef production. And once they take off, it can be rather catastrophic.
Yeah. So what we've seen in the last 3 years, that approximately 20 cases per year were occurring. So we have on the figure on the right, you see in 2023, 2024, we reported 16 cases. In 2025, we kind of had a peak of 24 cases. When we looked at the causes, and again, news clippings is not the best source for causes because this is what they're being told. And a lot of times this is a developing story, so they usually don't have causes. But where it was mentioned, electrical was cited 4 times as the cause. Heat lapse was 2 times as the cause. Hay combusting was cited as 2, usually due to heat lamps or sometimes electrical. We had 1 case of a lightning strike. We had a case of a propane tank exploding. And we had 5 external fires that started that basically, there were bonfires or brush fires that ended up basically burning the barns alongside them.
Sure. And just a little bit on the cause, you have to understand in the fire service, unless we can actually put the actual ignition source to the whatever ignited, they will, sometimes it's just listed as undetermined because we can't determine, we can't rule out all of the different sources. In this case, if they knew that they had a heat lamp that was a problem, or they found the heat lamp, if they knew that the hay was in question and it combusted, so forth and so on. But a lot of times with the reports that I'm sure you look at, you'll see the ones that are just undetermined, and strictly it is a fact of that's where we have to go. I'm a certified fire investigator, so I know that that's unfortunately what I have to do, because if I have 2 possible sources, I can't say specifically it's one or the other. And the other thing I'd like to mention here too, we had arson listed as one. From time to time, people will have an older building sitting out maybe on some property, and maybe it's not something that they use all the time, but that building is someone burns it. Okay. If they do, please still report those. What we have found in the fire service is people start out small and then start to build on what once they burn one building, then they go to another. And if we don't get them reported and develop some sort of a pattern, then someone's house or someone's shop or machine shed or something then burns. And if we can develop that pattern by calling the state fire marshal's office and getting them involved and so forth, it is so much the better. Just a little on barn fires. The thing that we always recommend is inspect all your heating equipment well in advance of using it. I'm actually a sheep producer, and before I start lambing in January, usually about November, I go through all my heat lamps that I may be using, and I try to use them on a limited basis, but from time to time the weather changes and we need to use them. And make sure that all the wiring is in good shape. Make sure that all the porcelain fixtures inside are in good shape. I actually buy a type of heat lamp that literally, if it falls on into bedding or something, is less likely to start a fire as opposed to some of the metal type ones that we see out there. So just when you're using the heating equipment, I know that, it takes a little extra time, but we need to go through and just inspect it really well and make sure it all works properly. The other thing that we do, or we suggest, is using dedicated outlets for any heat lamps, tank deicers, or other types of equipment like that. I know of a friend of mine that's a sheep producer that has lost at least one barn and a number of lambs due to tank deicers, but the circuit for the whole barn was on one barn. So he was overloading that circuit, and unfortunately it caused him a major loss. If we can get dedicated outlets and dedicated circuits for those, because they do draw a lot of power, it's just a much safer, on the fire side, much safer for everyone concerned. The other thing, too, is use some sort of a protective guard with livestock so that they're not able to knock these heating equipment around or down. They're easy to build. There's a lot of plans out there through the Extension Service and so forth as far as making kind of a triangle area. I've even I know some people who use like a 30-gallon drum and put the heat lamp on the inside, the fixture inside the 30-gallon drum. It conserves the heat, but it also protects from like a U or something like that, knocking it down and causing a fire. The other thing that we found to be very safety conscious as far as fires, and also it kind of adds to economics, is using thermal cubes. When we're using heating equipment, the thermal cube comes on when it's 35 degrees and goes off when it's 45. It just helps that heat lamp or that de-icer cycle. They work very, very well with the de-icers because, it's going to do the job that you need it to do, but it's not going to be on all the time. And in other words, pulling on that circuit the whole time, even when it's not really necessary. If we use fans in the summertime, we want to make sure that we keep them clean and we don't have any debris on those fans. That makes the motors work harder, in turn causes them to create more heat, and also just any kind of obstructions. If they, something happens, straw, hay, whatever, blows and gets sucked into those, again, that excess heat, then you've got a source for the ignition right there, some material that's combustible, and it can cause major fires.
So our next type of incidents is machine sheds and shop fires. An example for this is, so in 2023, we had an owner, he was working on a UTV, and this UTV, he was working on it because it was malfunctioning, and it caught fire while he was working on it. And he ran to get the fire extinguisher, but before he could get back, that fire had reached the fuel tank, and it exploded, and it got the whole pole barn on fire. The pole barn was about 60 by 80 feet, that dimension for it, and it was fully engulfed in flames. He immediately called the fire department, and where they were able to help, they couldn't rescue this barn. It was completely engulfed. But he had another barn that was 35 feet away, and they were able to protect that second barn from catching fire. That fire ended up destroying not just a UTV, but he had 2 new tractors inside it. He had several antique tractors and even a skid steer. So it can be fairly major loss in these cases. When it comes to machine shed and shop fires, it is very rare that the cause is mentioned. So in the example I gave you, that was more of the exception than the rule. Sometimes in the last 3 years, we see fuel tanks, we see charging batteries, we see lightning strikes, and arson as the main cause. I've included, when I said machine sheds and shop fires, I included in it any barns used for storing equipment. And so we saw a lot of these cases in 2023, and these have been going down. But it's unclear yet if this is a long-term trend or just, the variety between year to year.
One of the things I point out here is the charging of the batteries. So many things have gone to using lithium-ion batteries, and just be cautious about charging them with fluctuating temperatures. The chargers are supposed to do their job and kind of monitor that, but still we're seeing some issues with those. The other thing I will mention too, you talked about, he called the fire department. If you have a fire, and it seems like it's going to get out of hand, get the fire department en route as soon as possible. My own fire district's 124 square miles. And because of an area that has a large lake in the southwest corner, it takes us sometimes 15 to 18 minutes to get there because there's just no good road to get to that area. So the sooner we're called, the sooner we're en route, so much the better chance we have of saving property and not having any other issues. When we look at these shop and shed fires, if we're using grinders or torches and so forth, we want to use that in an area where it's free of combustibles. I even like to do most of the work that I do right at the door, right out, just almost outside, so that any of those sparks and so forth are going outside. I make sure that we clean the area. If we're working, for instance, on a hay baler, we make sure we've got all that debris picked up before we start to change a bearing or something like that, because it can be, you've got to have the combustible and you've got to have an ignition source to have a fire. And that, if we can keep those two apart, so much the better. Make sure all your breakers are clearly marked in the breaker box. From time to time, we go some places, there's not even a cover on the breaker box and so forth. And hopefully, if you've got breaker boxes or fuse boxes in your shops or machine sheds, you've got those clearly marked. So if we do have to isolate that, we know which ones to turn off. It could be that we're the one going in to turn it off because of maybe a heavy smoke condition or something like that. So I'm sure you know which breakers go to where, but we need to be able to identify them ourselves when we go in to fight that fire. And then have the proper fire extinguishers ready. And we'll talk a little bit later about fire extinguishers briefly, but and then know how to use them. If you don't know how to use them, get with your local fire department. That's an ideal training session for us. I know that's one of the things I do, and for the public, and I really enjoy it. I do it for kids in high school. I do it for senior citizens, and then I do it also for groups. So check with your local fire department. I'm sure that they would be more than happy to do some training on the use of fire extinguishers. Then the other thing too, we actually, in one of our programs that we teach, we show the inside of a farm shop. And the thing that it's probably the worst case scenario, because I know a lot of people do a really good job, but we need to keep all the fuels, oils, paints, cleaners, and all that in a central protected area, rather than having them spread out across the whole farm, the whole shop area. A little here and a little there, because what that encourages is if we do have a small fire in one area and then it gets into one of those particular items, and you've got other things stored other places, then it moves to that and so forth and so on. Before long, we've got a fully involved structure. The other thing too, if you've got a farm shop, again, make sure that the heating systems have all the proper safety devices on them. We've been called before to shops where some of the switches and monitoring equipment failed and caused the furnaces to overheat, which in turn caused the structure fire. And the other thing too, if you're not going to be in there and away for a period of time, just, unless there's something that you have to preserve because you don't want it to freeze, just turn them off so that, because if you're not going to be there where you can monitor it, just turn them off.
So our next structures is grain facility fires. And this is, in a sense, this is a happy story. So I've shared with you two sad stories. But this is a happy story in which an employee noticed smoke was coming from a grain facility, and he immediately reached out to firefighters. They were able to locate, firefighters were able to locate the smoldering area. They found that it was near an access panel about 60 feet up, and then they were able to knock down the fire using a hand line. They also flooded the whole bin using a ladder truck, and that was it. The fire did not spread. It was initially noticed around 10 a.m. and by 1:30 it was fully controlled. And that's a success story in a sense when it comes to dealing and handling these facility fires, because that could also go out of control pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
These grain facility fires tend to be rare. So on average, we see about one incident per year. 2025, we had 3. And usually it's because grain was smoldering in the bin. That's the main cause that we're seeing when we see these incidents. We also sometimes see it's the fire starting in a grain dryer, and then also with conveyor belts.
Sure. The thing here again is prevention. I think some of the fires that I have been on, it's with grain bins or grain dryers, it's something has happened mechanically that caused, something didn't shut off when it should have, and it caused the grain to ignite. So if you can get a qualified technician in there to check it over before we start using that drying equipment, during harvest or before we're going to put it into service. Again, just have them run it, make sure everything, all the safety devices work, and it's going, if it would overheat, it would shut down and that kind of thing. The other thing too is just keep a watch on stored grain. It can ignite. There can be some issues where it just self-ignites or causes hot spots and that kind of thing. And just develop a schedule where you check these for these issues, on a weekly basis. Whether you have 2 grain bins or 20, you just have some kind of a regiment where you go out there and check these bins. And the other thing I'm going to say on the grain bin rescue side of my work is 2 people need to go check these bins when you're checking them. Don't go by yourself. If you do have a fire, number one, again, call the fire department as soon as possible, but never run burned or burning grain through your grain handling facility or system. There's a lot of dust involved with grain handling, and a dust explosion can be catastrophic for these. And you're going to start running embers through there. And to be quite honest, if you try to empty a bin that actually has an active fire in it through the normal sump in the bottom and that kind of thing, probably the grain that is already burned is going to get down there, clog up the sump, and then cause even a greater problem. So call the fire department, work with them, and we'll kind of talk here just a little bit about some of the procedures for safely handling this. We need to get it out for everybody's safety. We don't want to have a dust explosion. Sometimes the best way to handle a grain bin fire is we cut the side of the bin just in the panel itself, not across any bolt patterns or anything like that. And we pull that grain out slowly and meticulously and get it outside and get it put out. Now that depends on how big of an area, like the one that Salah talked about. We've got thermal imaging cameras that we carry on the engines, and we can identify, just how bad the situation is. And if it's a small area and so forth, there's a possibility we can put it out with minimal damage to any of the equipment. Dryer fires, I honestly think, Salah, that there's more dryer fires going on than what we actually hear about. You just don't. I know in my area, we actually had one last year, and I don't think it really got even reported as a grain dryer fire as far as the news or anything like that. And a lot of times like the one that we had was minor. It scorched the grain a little bit. We went out and helped them unload the batch dryer and made sure that they weren't putting any, grain that was actually on fire or even had any kind of a temperature close to ignition temperature. We helped them move it out of that facility safely. But a lot of times the best thing we can do is just move that grain out, get it out, and get it put out. Again, this is another place that's extremely important to have our breakers properly labeled so that we know where we can shut the ventilation off, where we can shut the grain handling systems off, both because we don't want the grain to move through the system itself, and also just for the safety of both the folks on the farm and the first responders. We don't want anything to kick on and someone be near and get tangled up.
So we went through how fires can occur in your structures and how to prevent them. But prevention is just the first step, right? You want to prepare for a fire. You don't know what's going to happen. And it's important that you take the actions now to prepare in case a fire occurs, so you could respond to it properly, minimize the damage associated with it, and be able to recover as fast as possible. Part of that, when it comes to preparing for a fire, there's a lot of things you could do. First and foremost is developing emergency plans and developing fire plans, which we'll focus here more on here. Second thing is learning how to use a fire extinguisher, which Bill will cover later on as well. And then lastly is getting to know your firefighters. So we will cover all three in this second half of our presentation. So the first one is emergency action plans. So these are just basically documents that describe the actions to be taken to ensure employee safety during an emergency. If you are an employer and you have employees working on your, could be animal production facilities, could be your grain handling facilities, you would want to have an emergency action plan. And the benefits for this plan is that, when you're facilitating communication between the worker and the employer ahead of time, there's a lot of assumptions that goes on that we think either the worker knows or the employer knows that actually doesn't get stated, and the other party doesn't actually know. So that's really where we see a benefit, is that by facilitating that communication, by making it clear on paper the expectations for the different parties, it leads to fewer and less severe injuries. It also could lead to less structural damage, and most importantly, it reduces the confusion of how to respond when you have a fire occurring. One of the most important aspects of these is developing evacuation procedures and emergency escape plans. It's important that you properly label these plans and share it with your workers. So where should they go? How they should get out of the facility? Where should be the access point where you all meet up so you can account for your employees? If there's, depending on the size of your facility, you might want to label who will be in charge of rescue or medical duties for any person that is injured. This could be just as simple as saying, we're just call 911, or they're going to be responsible for that. It's totally depending on the size of your facility. It's another important aspect is who are the contact persons? Who are we supposed to contact and get involved in this situation when it occurs? And then how do you go about reporting it? What is your chain of command? These are all different aspects that are really important to think about, especially if you have a large facility before you have a fire, because you just never know. You could do all the prevention plans possible, but then just have a lightning strike or have something totally come on left field. So it's really important to not only try to prevent fires, but to prepare for them as well. And I think, Bill, you wanted to add more on fire prevention plans, right?
When we look at fire prevention plans, we want to make sure that the employees know where the fire hazards can be. We want them to understand, again, the fire triangle, like the one that we've got here in the slide. We have to have all three of these components for there to be a fire. If we take one of those out, this is the basic thing we work with as firefighters, is we take one of those away and the fire should go out. So, you have a rapid chemical reaction between the oxygen and combustible material. That actually is a fire tetrahedron. But if I can cool something down and get it below the ignition point, then I've taken that heat away. If I take, if I've got let's say I've got a propane line on fire, if I can go shut that valve off, then I've taken the fuel away. If I'm using a fire extinguisher, most of those are designed to both cool and also to put a layer between the fuel and the oxygen, so that it takes the oxygen away from it. So any of those things, if we can work with our employees and make them understand that that's what we're trying to do, then we have to look at where could we have a problem? Where we got open flames? Where could we have embers, such as, from doing hot work or something like that? Where do we get hot sources such as heating lamps and that kind of thing? Where are we going to have electrical sparks or mechanical sparks? Hopefully, mechanical sparks are not that often. Electrical sparking sometimes is a situation where we need to do some repair in our electrical system. But if someone reports that, then we know that we need to get that shut down until we get it straightened out. Lightning, you're not going to do much about that, but they need to be aware if a storm does develop, that kind of keep an eye out on what's going on in the buildings and around the farm. If we know that we've had some really close lightning strikes. If we're doing hot work, we need to not just go do it and then leave. We need to do probably about a 30 minutes fire watch just to make sure that everything's cooled down and that we're not having any issues with some of the sparks and so forth that were given off when we were doing hot work. If we're burning brush, please stay with it until it's completely out. We actually, just in the last 2 weeks, I've handled a fire where a gentleman had a small brush fire burning and thought, he even went to the point of he wet the grass around it, or he thought he did, and so forth. And it ended up costing about a $50,000 damage to a machine shed because it got up, it burned through the grass to the edge of the machine shed, got in some stacked material by the machine shed, and actually the heat caused the interior of the building to catch fire. So stay with it until we make sure that it's out. We want to only use, approved metal safety containers or something, whatever the original manufacturer's container is for storage of any of the flammables. Again, housekeeping, we hit on that a lot, but housekeeping is essential, and again, keep it in its own area. If you've got a cabinet for flammables, that's great. A lot of people don't, but at least have it in an area where it's protected away from any of the other things that are going on, like in a shop area. And for goodness sake, don't make that area right where the exit is or any passageway for employees. We always tell people, and we'll cover this a little bit with the fire extinguishers, but whatever you do, don't cut off your exit with something that can catch fire. Make sure you can get out. And again, keep it away from any kind of ignition sources. As far as personal protective equipment, when you're doing like hot work and that kind of thing, have long sleeves, preferably materials that aren't going to be combustible. Definitely not something that you've been working in some of the petroleum products and got it on your coveralls or whatever. We don't want to cause any burns or cause you to actually catch fire. As far as fire suppression, we want to have portable fire extinguishers available. You could have fixed systems. Some places do. It's becoming more and more popular to have a fixed extinguishing system. When we look at the classes of fires, a Class A fire is common combustibles. What we usually say is anything that can make ash, like wood, paper, fabrics, cloth, plastics, that kind of thing. Class B fires, that's flammable liquids. I even had one of our younger guys said, well, anything can be put in a barrel, so it's Class B. No, well, that's not necessarily why it's a Class B, but that does make sense. It also can be some, natural gas, propane, that kind of thing. Class C is energized electrical equipment. Any of your panels, your appliances, any kind of electronics. A lot of times if we just de-energize them, the fire will go out. But we'll talk a little bit about the extinguishers we can use on those. One we don't see a lot on the farm as far as actually having an extinguisher for it, but it is the Class D fires, which are combustible metals like magnesium. Now, not to say that we don't see magnesium fires on the farm, because that has been that. You start looking at some of the components now, like transmission housings and that kind of thing, or wheels on vehicles. We can still have magnesium fires for sure. Probably the one you don't see a whole lot on the farm, but has become something in the last, probably 6 to 7 years, is a Class K fire, which is a commercial cooking fire. We were having a lot of problems with like fryers in fast food establishments that would have a fire. They'd use a Class B extinguisher on it, but it was still hot and it would still reignite. Class K extinguisher is actually a liquid product that makes a film over the top of those vegetable oils and fats and seals it off and doesn't allow that oxygen to get back in there. It's through a process of saponification, which is actually kind of like making homemade soap. When we look at fire extinguishers, water extinguishers, Class A fires, you don't want to use them on, really, they're not effective on any of the other type fires. They can actually cause more problems with the flammable liquids. Obviously, they're not going to work on flammable gases. You don't want to put it on energized electrical equipment, so that's why it's primarily a Class A fire. You see some of these like on hay balers and that kind of thing. Foam extinguishers, not super effective on Class A fires. Work extremely well with the flammable liquids. They won't work on pressurized gases. And they are good if we have any kind of issue with vehicles. CO2 extinguishers, not super effective on Class A fires, but they work really well on Class B and C fires. And they're not going to conduct electricity, so they'll work there as well. The biggest problem, a CO2 extinguisher is rather expensive. And then you get into the ABC type powder fires. They will work on a Class A fire. They will separate the oxygen and the fuel, but they're not as effective probably as just plain water or the water extinguisher. But they work on all of the others very, very well. They're not going to conduct electricity or anything like that. The thing I want to point out about fire extinguishers right off the bat is if you have a small fire and you put that fire out with a fire extinguisher, make sure that you have it recharged, no matter if you used it for 2 seconds or 20 seconds. The typical extinguisher will completely discharge in about 18 seconds. But the thing is, if we just put it back on the rack, because we only used it for a very short time, one burst put the fire out, you may need that extra powder or whatever product you're using the next time for a larger fire. So always have them recharged after any use. Extinguishers just, again, work just by either removing heat, displacing the oxygen. That's what a CO2 extinguisher basically does. It has a cooling effect and displaces the oxygen, or they just stop the chemical reaction. This is just the different parts of a fire extinguisher. One thing I will point out, probably the number one mistake made by both firefighters and civilians is pulling the pin. All fire extinguishers, for the most part, have a pin that needs to be pulled so that the valve mechanism can work. And I don't know how many times, especially like combine fires, I have pulled up to a fire, and the guy standing there, he's got an extinguisher in his hand, and he says, "This doggone thing wouldn't work. I could not get it to discharge." And I said, "Let me look at it." And the pin's still in there. And I said, "Did you pull the pin?" "What pin?" And we'll talk about how to properly use it here in just a second. Here's just a broad view of all the different type of extinguishers that are out there. There's just, like I say, different types. Typically what we recommend as a general extinguisher is an ABC powder type extinguisher because it covers so many of the different fires. They're rather inexpensive to own, and they're easy to maintain. Again, this is just a list of some of the things that, the water, the CO2, the powder, the wet chemical, and the foam extinguishers. They all have their different areas where they work exceptionally well, but like I say, the one that we typically recommend is the ABC powder extinguisher because it does cover a broader area than most of the others. As far as a water extinguisher, it's just a big squirt gun. all we do with it is we put in, usually it's around 4 gallon of water, and then we just take it. It actually has a fitting like any kind of a inner tube or tire, and you air it up until the gauge shows that it's in the green area, and it's ready to go. And it'll shoot water, 20 feet if need be. And again, any of the Class A fires, it works really well on it. Has that cooling effect, just like a garden hose or whatever, just a little easier to handle sometimes or easier to get to quickly. CO2, again, is not a bad product. There's a couple of downsides to it. Number one, cost, and number two, air movement. It's not something that we can really use outside because, again, it has to displace that oxygen. And if we are outside and it's slightly windy or even extremely windy, it's just going to blow the CO2 away. It's not going to displace the oxygen, and you're going to have a hard time getting that fire put out. Dry chemical, again, just a general good extinguisher to have. I would recommend, they come in smaller ones like 5-pounders. I usually recommend for farm use somewhere between a 10 and 20 pounder. 20 pounds is a little cumbersome. 10 pounds, if you put a couple of them in the shop or wherever in the, at least one in each vehicle and that kind of thing, they're 10 pounds. A 10-pound extinguisher will usually put out any small fire. If it gets anything above that, you probably need to call the fire department anyway. So how do we use the fire extinguisher? We use the pass method. And the pass method is really simple. Number one, we pull that pin, get that pin out of there. I don't care what you do with it. Drop it, put it in your pocket, whatever. It doesn't make any difference. You're going to put a new one in it when you have it recharged anyway. Then we aim the extinguisher. Now, if you look on this particular slide, you see how that person has that grip on that nozzle. I always tell people when we're doing training, hold it like you're watering the garden. Because if you try to hold it back on the tube itself, you're probably going to get to find out what that powder tastes like. Because it is under pressure. It has a nitrogen gas in there that forces the powder out. And once it hits a solid object, it's going to probably flip backwards. So hold it down towards the end, just like you're watering the garden. Then we squeeze the valve, the two handles together, and to expel the product. And then we sweep back and forth at the base of the fire. We don't put the powder in the flames. We put the powder at the base, right where the fuel is, and try to build a layer between the oxygen, the heat, and the fuel itself. If we use the extinguisher and it reignites, we probably just need to make sure and one of the things we also teach people is call the fire department anyway, unless there's any kind of a question that it's going to be out quickly. We're more than happy to come out and take a look and make sure that we don't have any extension anywhere, like into cabinets, into the walls and that kind of thing, if it's up against a wall. The other thing I tell people is if, you get the extinguisher and think you've got the right one and you start to put that fire out and things just don't feel right, you don't have the right feeling about it, get out, call the fire department. That's what we're there for. Let us take care of it. The other thing I will tell you too, these have pretty good reach. You don't have to get right up on the fire to put it out. So again, don't cut your exit off. If it's, let's say you've got a fire in a storage room, don't walk into the room and start concentrating, get tunnel vision on that fire, and then all of a sudden the fire has spread around and cut off your exit. So again, pass system works super good. You pull a pin, you aim the extinguisher, you squeeze the handles together to release the product, and then sweep back and forth right there across the top of that fuel. As far as maintenance, we just need to inspect that bottle, make sure it doesn't have any rust or anything like that. Make sure the handle's in good shape. Make sure that with the hose that we don't have mud daubers filling that tube full of making a nest in there. I've seen that on a lot of combines. I've seen it also in some of the grain trucks and also on some of the farm equipment. Make sure that is always free and clean because it doesn't have enough pressure to blow something like that out of the tube when you need to use it. Check it for sure. We like to see them checked every month just to make sure that gauge is in the green, because there are things that can happen where the pressure may leak or something, and then have them inspected annually. The other thing that's really good to do with those from time to time is just, that powder does settle, especially in the ABC powder type extinguishers. Turn them upside down and give them a good shake just to make sure that powder's, free and ready to be expelled. Well, the other thing we like to talk about is knowing your fire department. And maybe this is something that's kind of my when I get off the engine at a fire, I like to know who I'm seeing. I like to have some kind of acquaintance with the people I'm dealing with, especially in industry, in agriculture. Of course, with my living on a farm and being associated in the farm community, a lot of times I know exactly who I'm going, where we're going, and that kind of thing. But if you don't know your fire department people, your chief, some of the officers, some of the firefighters, get to know them. If you've got a facility that doesn't exactly have an address, and we see this with grain facilities a lot of times, or maybe sometimes with some of the livestock facilities where they're not exactly at the home farm and they don't have a 911 address. You don't receive mail there, so you don't have an exact address. Make them aware of that, because that could be exactly where we need to go and make sure that they understand how to get there, what roads to take, how to get the gates open, that kind of thing. Because sometimes trying to describe that to a dispatcher so that they can get you there, get us there, I should say, it can be difficult if they're not acquainted with that. And if you have any kind of special hazards that you know of on your farm, please point those out to us. Let's say you've got a chemical loading facility or storage facility at your farm. That's a no water area. If for your sake and our sake both, we probably will just let it burn. I mean, that's the economically and safety. That's probably the best thing we can do, rather than causing a lot of runoff and that kind of thing. So if you've got any special hazards or any common hazards, just point those out to us. And again, we're happy to come out. We do a lot of training. We're happy to come out and get to know you and maybe tour your farm and you can show us where some of the shutoffs are at, where your fuel systems are. And, if there may be something that we see that we need to ask you about, or there may be something that you need to know from us. If this happens, where are you going to bring the engine in? Where are you going to bring some of the other equipment in? So get to know your fire department. It is a great advantage.
And just jumping straight into that point, there are tools that you could use. So example is National Farm Medicine Center. They have this website you can go to. It's called Farm Mapper. You can create your own free account. And when you go into that, you can go using GPS coordinates. You can find your farm specifically. And then you can actually list out all the hazards or all the equipment or anything you want to share with the fire department. Basically, you could list them out. You can share this tool with the fire department. And then that allows basically from both sides to, in advance notice, know where to go and what they need to do and so on. With that, I'm going to head to the conclusion. A fire can start anytime. Preparedness is crucial to address these situations.
Yeah. Prevention is always the best thing about fires. Fires can be devastating. Fires are not, we see, over the last 30 years, I've seen a lot of people where it's been devastating for them. And the best thing is prevention on any of these, whether it's structure fire, whether it's mechanical fires with machinery or whatever. We want to reduce any kind of chance of a fire. And we also want, again, like centralizing our flammables and stuff in the shop. We want to reduce the impact of that fire. Get it, get those in a central area where they can be protected. I mean, as soon as we get there, tell us, hey, all the flammables are in the southwest corner of my shop. That's we want to know those things, and we will protect them as much as we can. I have even been on one farm where a gentleman, the owner, told me, he said, if this machine shed burns, I want you to protect the seed in this one area rather than my tractor in the other area, because he was growing a specific type of seed that was the only parent material that was out there, and it was actually more valuable than the farm equipment that was in that shed.
With that concludes our session for today. And as you're writing your questions and answers, I'm just going to let you know what's to expect and thank our sponsors. So this is our first in a series that we'll be hosting until November. We are targeting basically our Wednesdays around from 11 to 12. And we have a lot of great events and programs going on, and more specifically geared towards Illinois based on the cases that we have been hearing and seeing across the state. I'd like to thank our sponsors. We have TIAA, Center of Farmland Research, CoBank, Comper Financial, Farm Credit Illinois, FNS Growmark, Illinois Corn, Illinois Soybean, and John Deere. I'd also like to thank our educational partners as well. And as a reminder, all of this content will be available later on at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu. And we have a great set of resources from previous years on safety and other topics as well. And lastly but not least, you can also check out the latest work that we're doing in Ag Safety and Health, our research lab. You could go to go.illinois.edu/ISSA-lab and get to see some of the work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. Oh, we have a question actually. Yeah. So, Bill, I guess this goes for you directly. What type of extinguisher works best for a wood-burning stove?
Of course, you can use the water extinguisher on those. But I still prefer the ABC dry chem. It's that way you're covered in case there's other issues happen. But with a wood-burning stove, either the Class A extinguisher, which is a water extinguisher, like I say, just a big squirt gun, or the ABC dry chem. I will tell you the difference in the two is the cleanup with the water extinguisher is much easier than the cleanup with a dry. Because if you discharge a dry chem in an area, it's going to go throughout the whole building.
Let me ask you this question. Because I was thinking about how you do some of the training, and if you're doing this training with chemical extinguishers outdoors, is there any environmental risks? Like what isn't that?
Most of the like the dry chem extinguishers are bicarbonate soda. Is one of the products that they use for and they're all safe. I mentioned that you might get a face full of it. None of them, it's going to be real. If you can imagine taking a tablespoon of bicarbonate soda and just spooning it in your mouth, that's kind of what it's like. But none of them are harmful to humans or pets or anything like that. What we actually do with our training, there's more sophisticated systems and so forth. But with us, we put just a little bit of a flammable liquid in a cut-off 15-gallon barrel. And just have them actually go out and extinguish it from a distance, Oh,
that's awesome. Oh, 1 second. We have one last question. How do you deal with a lithium fire?
Okay, lithium fires are becoming quite an issue. There's a number of different ideas out there. And I'm assuming when you say lithium fire, you're talking about lithium-ion batteries, that kind of thing. The biggest thing is if we can isolate them. There's, like I say, a number of different things out there. The biggest, again, with lithium, the best thing is prevention. Lithium batteries, like if you drop even like a battery that you're using with a tool, make sure you isolate that, because that can actually trigger runaway, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to try to charge them when it's either hot or cold. And like I say, typically the charger won't allow that, but some have triggered and gone ahead and done that. But I don't like to leave batteries on chargers indefinitely. Get them charged and then get them, set away. But copious amounts of water is one of the main things that we can do. And if you have one that starts runaway, again, just get it out of the building as safely as possible, because it will sit there, and it actually becomes like a blowtorch. We're seeing more and more of this. It's kind of a new field to have to deal with, actually.
Well, we're at the hour, so we're gonna end it for today. We really appreciate the feedback that we received, and we appreciate all the questions. If you want to reach out to either Bill or myself, this is our contact information, which you'll also have access to the handouts. Thank you very much.